Ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty, good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Bagwell, as Mr. Clark said, and I'm currently pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts with a concentration in ceramics here at Jacksonville State University. Today I want to talk to you about a research project I worked on last semester for my independent study. The focus of this project was to make a series of ceramic-covered books. First off, my inspiration for this project. I was inspired mainly by my bookmaking class I took last semester with Miss Mary Ann Sampson. She showed us a wide variety of different forms of books, and little did I know that books came in so many different and varying forms. I was also inspired by the cuneiform tablets that we studied in art history with Dr. Hendricks. They are essentially the first ceramic books that are known. And then, after doing online searches and research, I actually found ceramic-covered books online. Those books did not come with any kind of instructions on how to make them, unfortunately. So I had to start completely from scratch, making the mistakes, and rolling with the punches as they came. This made my determination ever more resolute to actually make a functioning ceramic-covered book. But right now, I'm going to talk to you about my materials, my processes, and methods for making these books. It is extremely process-oriented, and you pretty much can't skip any kind of steps, unfortunately. But right now, the materials. For your clay and your glazes, you have to select the proper clay. The one thing I found out is that the clay body has to be formulated for making tiles. These clays usually have a large amount of grog in them, which is basically clay that's been fired, ground up, and put into another clay body. It gives it stability, reduces shrinkage, and aids in even drying to keep the covers flat. I was lucky enough to have met the owners of Stone Mountain Clay Company outside Atlanta, Georgia at Clay Conference, and they helped me select the right clays for this project. And I've used their clays exclusively in my work. They come in a variety of colors, and some clay bodies even have a speckle in them when fired to maturation. What glazes you should use depends on your clay body, the composition of the materials, and your final firing temperature, of course. Next was the paper. I selected a heavyweight paper for this project, Stonehenge 250 GSM printmaking paper. This paper is significantly thicker than your typical copy or printer paper, which measures around 70 to 90 GSM. I purchased this paper in 30 by 44 sheets, which is more cost effective for the process. This paper is also 100% cotton and acid free, therefore archival and won't break down over time. Now for the thread, I had to use a pretty thick thread for this project to hold this thick paper and these thick covers together. I consulted with Ms. Sampson on thread thickness, and she pointed out that the standard 18-3 thread that would be too thin that's normally used in bookmaking. Therefore, I went with a thicker 12-3 linen thread, which held its own against the weight of the paper and of the covers and provides good stability for them. The linen thread also doesn't stretch, and so the stitching remains tight over time. So now I'll take you through my process of how I make these. But first, there's the ceramic process. After selecting a proper clay body, I cut off a 2-inch slab from the 25-pound brick, and I start throwing it out to flatten it out. After throwing it out, I place it between canvas mats and onto the slab roller, which is a piece of equipment we use in the ceramic studio, to make the clay a uniform thickness, with the thickness set to 1/4 of an inch. After rolling out the slab, I take and I carefully lift the clay off the mats and put it on a piece of drywall covered with plastic till it gets leather hard. Drying it on top of the drywall helps keep the clay flat and dries it evenly from underneath and above. Then I use wooden patterns that I've cut out myself to take and keep my size consistent to cut the covers out with, just using a plain knife to slice through the leather hard clay with. After cutting out the covers, I use a Sureform, which is like a rasp, to round the edges and the corners to give it a nice, softer feel. Then I use a ruler to mark equally spaced holes that I go back and I drill out with a 1/4 inch drill bit. This makes the holes big enough for me to run my needle through after everything's fired, and still allow for a little bit of shrinkage. I then place the covers back onto the drywall, loosely covered with plastic, to allow them to finish drying. So that way, they're ready for the bisque fire. And once I get them ready for the bisque fire, I take them and I set them on the kiln shelves that have been lightly sanded with play sand, and place post around the edges. Set my next shelf down, sand it, and place the covers on it. And I put them in stacks of 2 to help minimize, maximize kiln capacity and make it more efficient. Now, after I pull them out of the kiln after the bisque fire, I take and I wipe them clean, sand any spots that need to be sanded down due to rough spots, and wash it off with a wet sponge and allow it to dry, because that allows for the best glaze adhesion. Now, you have to choose a glaze that complements your clay body, and you apply it by either dipping, pouring, brushing, or spraying the glaze on. You have to be careful, though, not to get glaze anywhere you don't want it, because then your tile will glue itself to the shelf during the glaze firing, which is unfortunate, and I've done. You also have to make certain that you clean out the holes well in case you get any glaze in them, because unfortunately the glaze will cover up your holes and you'll have to buy a special drill bit to unglaze your holes. Now, once you got your covers glazed, you're ready for the glaze firing, and I just lay them in a single layer onto the kiln shelves and stack the kiln back up. I leave the sand out this time because the sand, which is silica, will turn to glass during the glaze firing. And then after the kiln's cooled to room temperature, I get to remove my beautiful new covers, and the binding process starts. Now, the binding process is, I'll just say, wow. That's the best way to describe it sometimes. The first thing you want to do is measure the covers. You'll have to refer back to these measurements several times during your process. Then I take a sheet of the Stonehenge paper and start by folding it short end to short end, such as this. And I keep folding it like that till I get my paper down to about 1/8 inch the size of the cover when it's folded in half. Now, sometimes, depending on the cover size, I have to take and trim a little paper off, which I do by basically putting a ruler on top of the edge of the paper and just tearing it. Gives it a deckled edge and makes it a little bit more decorative. Then I take that folded paper, and using the 2 folded sheets, I nest them together, and this gives me my signature. And in total, I put about 8 signatures per book. Now, remembering that this is extremely thick paper, they end up about this thick by the time I get finished. Oh, sorry. I went through a couple, forgot. Then, using the ceramic covers, I use the holes that I've already drilled to make my pattern to punch the holes with. And I go ahead and pre-punch the holes through the signatures to make it easier for stitching. Then I measure out my thread. Then I set up the unstitched book first. Then I measure out the thread. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I take and I set the unstitched book together so that way I can see exactly how it's going to go together and make sure all my holes line up properly. Flip pages if needed. Sorry, I got off track there for a second. Then you measure out your thread. Now, what I do is I take and I measure out 12 lengths for the side of the book that's going to be bound. So, for instance, we'll say this is the side of the book that the binding would. I would measure out 12 lengths. It does make it a little long and makes it a little unruly, and it does get tangled. But it keeps me from having to tie on an extra piece of thread halfway through the book, which can be a pain in the tuchus. And that's the nice way to put it. But now, after I have that thread, I wax it with natural beeswax, and I insert it into the eye of the needle. Now, waxing it with the beeswax helps keep it from tangling and lets it go through the holes easier of the book. Then you start stitching your book together. Now I use a single needle Coptic stitch to stitch my book together, which I learned from YouTube since it wasn't a stitch we learned in bookmaking class. I had to modify the stitch a little to make it more pertinent for my uses and to help with the stitching process altogether. And then after you finish stitching, you have your whole book, it's done. But now, some of the problems I discovered when I first started this process, and as I went along through the process, my first set was totally unusable. I went into it willy-nilly and didn't really talk to anyone about it. I was just going to make a ceramic book. And everyone was just going to go, ooh. Didn't work like that, honestly. My first cover suffered from bad hole placement, and after talking with Miss Sampson, she instructed me on proper hole placement. I also ran into a lot of warped covers too. And my problem with my warped covers were I was trying to glaze the inside and the outside of each cover and then firing it on a bed of nails. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the material, clay needs support, and any part that wasn't supported sagged and warped. Didn't mean the covers were not usable. I still made books with them, and the paper helped conform to that. And it started me on the process of taking and leaving one side unglazed and flat against the shelf, which gave me flatter covers. Loose stitching was also a problem, especially when I followed the YouTube video exactly. It said to stitch on the last cover and the last signature at the same time, and I modified that by stitching the last signature on and then doing going back and stitching the last cover on. And then I have the unfortunate losses from time to time. They say every time you open a kiln it's like Christmas morning, and it really is, until you find that someone forgot to put batteries in the box or it's broken when it gets to you. And sometimes I did have the loss of the occasional cover. I'd have a crack, or a cover would be too warped that I couldn't use it. But to keep from losing an entire book, I would substitute a wooden back cut to the same size to use for a usable cover. Now, as far as further research and the opportunities go for this, I'm going to start doing different and varying stitches on these. I'm also going to start working on more sculptural and carved covers, and I'm going to start incorporating different media into my cover designs. And I'm also going to start working on different and varying glazes for my covers too. These are some of the books that I finished last semester. The one over here on the top right was part of the series that I did for my Design 3 class, which I used underglazes to give it the proper color, since Design 3 is color theory. And the book on the top left is a book that I did a varying stitch on, and one of the few that were actually very successful. The bottom left one is a cased-in ceramic covered book. I wanted it to have that traditional book look, and I had a few problems with it, but nothing that I can't tweak and work out in the end. And the middle one and the one over here on the bottom right are some of the examples I have. The one on the bottom right has a wooden cover on the back because the covers, after firing in the gas kiln, the colors didn't quite match anymore. It's the fun of a gas kiln. But now, if you're interested in seeing my ceramic covered books in person, oops, I forgot all this, sorry. I get ahead of myself. I get excited. But now, if you're interested in seeing my ceramic covered books, if you would like further information on them, please feel free to contact me. My email's up there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Y'all have a good evening.